Welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self-acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have an awesome guest with us. Her name is Laurel O'Sullivan. She's a grief educator, guide, and former public interest lawyer who helps people transform loss into deeper belonging with themselves and with others and with life. Over the past 2 decades, she has supported individuals and communities throughout profound transitions and has advocated in the public arena to shift narratives and influence change. Her work is deeply informed by personal experience, having lived through multiple kinds of loss, including the sudden death of her father and the father of her children, and most devastatingly, her 18-year-old son, Patrick, who died by suicide. She brings a rare depth of empathy and insight to her work. Today, she creates space where grief is honored, resilience is remembered, and healing becomes a bridge to connection and purpose. She is also the author of Lost and Found, a Substack publication exploring the intersection of personal grief, collective healing, and the possibility of renewal. So, without further ado, listeners, I want to invite Laurel onto the show. Laurel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. It's really good to be here.
Likewise, I'm really grateful to have you on today. I just wanted to say my condolences and my heart goes out to you for losing your son by suicide. That's a very tragic and a very sad loss. And from our pre-interview, by the way, I feel like in a lot of ways he gave you many gifts that you're out in the world today helping people in this profound capacity outside of your law career.
Thanks. Thanks, Chris. Yes, absolutely. I tell people that I didn't choose this path that I'm on, that grief chose me. And up until 3 years ago, when I lost Patrick, to be honest, I was still resisting a lot of what life had already been asking me to carry, which, as you mentioned, was a lot of sudden loss, sudden changes. That seems to be a theme in my life. I lost my dad 3 weeks before Patrick, my youngest son, was born. And then Patrick lost his dad rather suddenly, almost 3 years before he decided to leave this world. And so there's been this cycle of sort of death, sudden death, and changes outside of my control that I have really caused me to be here today talking to you about this. And it's a hard thing. I love that you call yourself an acceptance coach because, to be honest with you, I think most of us who find ourselves in this position of suddenly losing someone or even something in our life, we feel so powerless, and it's very easy to shut down and to go numb and to not accept um, what life has thrown at us. And it's the very definition of being human. And so acceptance, I will say that I'm 3 years out from this now, and so I'm grateful to be in a different place on my journey. But acceptance is definitely one of the keys to being able to move forward.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Laurel. Acceptance is, I think, the hardest part of grief because I've shared with people when you're in the throes of grief and especially if it's new and fresh, to hear that word acceptance is incredibly painful. It's almost hurtful to an extent. I
Yeah.
certainly felt that on my own grief journey. And what I've always shared with people about acceptance, by the way, it does not mean you like it and it does not mean you agree to it. Those are far from
Yeah.
what acceptance is. And acceptance is something that I think takes place in your own time. And I get asked a lot of questions about timelines with people in grief. And I say, I can't tell you if it's going to be a week, a month, 6 months, a year, 10. I can't tell you what that time frame looks like for when you're going to find acceptance. But I know that it will find you at a certain place that is right for you on your journey. And I think that's what's important about it. And back to acceptance. I phrase it in the way of, we don't like it and we don't have to agree to it, what happened. But what we find ourselves when we do get to acceptance is that we take that situation and that moment we experienced for exactly what it is, not what we think it is. And that's the
Mm,
place that we're able to start that healing journey of our own.
that's beautiful. I really like the way you just said that because we go through so much of life with these stories that we've told ourselves or we tell ourselves as a way, quite honestly, of just surviving. And at some point, those stories don't serve us anymore. Um, and if we're not telling ourselves stories, then, like I said, I think for a lot of us who've gone through catastrophic loss, it is overwhelming, and grief lives in our nervous system, and so it's both emotionally overwhelming, but can also just be physically overwhelming. And so I know for myself, before I got to this point of acceptance, um, there was a whole lot of, as I said earlier, numbing, but also just busyness. I got
Mm.
really good at being busy, doing things, even though I thought that I was really in my grief. And I can look back now and recognize that it was really only probably the last 6 to 12 months that I allowed myself to slow down enough to really be with the feelings. And that's when we can do some of our deepest healing.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the subject of that numb feeling? Because I've gotten that asked a lot in my grief journey, and I've also heard it from several guests. But I wanted to get your perspective on that. When you say that you felt numb, what kind of feelings
Yeah.
come up with that, or how would you describe that feeling?
It's a great question. And to be quite honest with you, I wouldn't have been able to say to somebody during that first year and a half to 2 years, I'm numb. And what I know now from having done a lot of the work is that for me, numbness throughout my life, not just losing my son, but I recognize now I've had many periods of time in my life where I've gone numb. It feels like fear. And the interesting thing
Mm.
is, C.S. Lewis, who wrote about the grief and loss of his wife, says the thing that people don't tell us is that grief feels like fear. And so when I read that, all of a sudden I started connecting the dots because I would say that most of the last 20 years of my life, which is when I lost my father, have intermittently felt like prolonged periods of numbness. And what I know now is that that actually is grief. Grief and an overwhelming inability to know what to do with those feelings for a lot of reasons that we can go into. Um, and so, what I would say to people is numbness is actually a feeling as well. I think we think of like when we hit our funny bone, but even that is the feeling or a sensation, that there is a numbness there. But what I've found is if you sit with the numbness for a while, what happens is there's almost this disorientation that overcomes you, and that's when the fear kind of, for me, would settle in. This feeling, almost not disassociation, because that's something kind of a clinical term, but it's just this feeling almost out of body of not understanding how you're supposed to inhabit the life that you once did. And so accompanying numbness can be just confusion and overwhelmness, being overwhelmed as well.
I've heard some people describe numbness as not really knowing how they feel. I've heard a lot of people say, when I feel numb, I just don't know. I just am in this paralysis place of I'm not sure how I feel. I'm not really sure what I'm experiencing right now, kind of like you said about confusion.
And also, I would say, and I've been in deep denial about this because I never thought of myself as a depressed person, but I now know it to be also just depression, like it's like being in a deep abyss or a deep void. Um, and, I think for me, that's where the busyness came in because it was sort of a way to kind of like, I thought, kind of snap myself out of it. Like if I could be doing something purposeful, whatever it was, however small it was, or keeping myself busy with activities or things, um, then I could avoid that numbness, that feeling of like, I have no idea who I am anymore without my youngest son, and I don't know where my life is going. I feel very foggy and uncertain. But if I can kind of get myself back into, you know, being active. So outwardly, a lot of people would look at me and thought, she's doing really well. And I think I even tricked myself at times into thinking, I'm doing really well. Look at me, I'm out here and I'm out and about and I'm, you know, doing the things. Because we have this notion of what grief looks like. And as you said, it's very particular to all of us. And the things, the ways that we came into this world and the lessons that we're here to learn and our adaptive mechanisms and all of that.
Well, I think that's something that a lot of people are fearful of grief because of societal conditioning that I've come across in my own journey. And what I've seen about grief that society says is, okay, well, you need to go over there and go deal with that thing over there. And when you're done fixing that, you can come back in the world. And I've
Mm.
talked to hundreds of people this year, and I've not met a single person that's capable of doing that. Funny story. But that's a belief that's out there about grief. It's this mentality of let it go and get over it, move on, and life happens. Um, People like you and I, for example, that have lost a child, that doesn't exist. There's no way for us to emotionally disconnect from that and to just say that was some experience we had in our life and then, okay, it happened. We don't really have that ability. And I don't think people who go through grief, by the way, are capable of emotionally disconnecting that harshly from something like that because we're human beings who have emotional experiences and we have emotions about everything we do during the day. So there's not really, it's not fair that society has conditioned us to think that way about grief when in reality it's something much, much different.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And grief is communal and it's not something to be solved, but it's something to be shared. And it took me a very long time to realize that because to be quite honest, my story and my background was one, as you said, of I was a public interest lawyer for 20 years. I was sort of David to Goliath. I was always used to being the strong one. Then I was a single mother dealing with a pretty dysfunctional former spouse. Um, and I then became remarried and a stepmother and have been through all of these changes. And with each sort of change of identity and role in life, I sort of doubled down on that, like protection mechanism of like, I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to be the strong one. I'm going to deny my needs. And I had no idea, honestly, until truly I lost my son, at how deep I was in this role, playing this role of somebody who often, you know, didn't even. I knew I had needs, but how to communicate them was a different matter. How to be vulnerable, and
Mm.
Brene Brown has this quote about how we don't get to selectively numb just the bad feelings. When we numb the darkness, we numb the joy. And I can sit here now, 3 years into this, and say that one, if you can call it a gift of losing my son, is this recognition of like we can't hold one without the other, or Susan Cain's written this beautiful book, Bittersweet, you don't get to know the sweetness without the bitter. And I'm learning, grief is our teacher. I'm learning that even in the deepest sorrow, there is an ability to find joy. But it has required me to do a whole lot of, I will say, sort of reconstructing my identity and questioning a lot of who I came into this world to be and how I adapted to that role in ways that were not healthy and not kind or loving to myself and often to other people around me.
And I think that's the big thing that I've learned on my grief journey is exactly what you said. I love that you said kind of reconstructing yourself. I think that grief, when we lose people too, it's very devastating. Whether you lose a son, you lose a father, you lose a spouse, even a pet for that matter. When we lose somebody that we have a big, strong emotional connection to, that's a big part of our life. There's parts of us that are falling away from us of who we were, and we're stepping into this version of ourselves of who we're supposed to become. And I call it stepping into our alignment in the spiritual realm of things. That's what I call it, stepping into alignment. And as you hinted at very eloquently, uh, when we go through this transformation process, grief is showing us what is being taken away and what's being removed from our life. And I always call it the things that don't serve us anymore, the beliefs, the conditioning, the
Yeah.
constructs we have. It all falls away. And grief
Yep.
is very scary for that reason because we're meeting this new person of who we're becoming. And I always kind of equate it to a first date. It's like, well, who is this person? What's this going to be like? What's going to be required of me to change for this? It's kind of this very uncertain place. And the more the way we let go, by the way, and embrace it and accept it, and that's the hardest part of grief, by the way, is that embracing acceptance part. That's the hardest place to get over here. But once you do, it gets a little bit easier.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree 100%. And nobody tells you how disorienting it is to not yet know the person you're becoming while also mourning the identity that you've left behind and the person you've left behind. And it's, so we're grieving on multiple levels. We're grieving the life that we thought we were going to have with the person or the job or the relationship. Um, and then when that's taken away, then there's this other path of, okay, so who am I now? And if I can share a little story, I recently had the really good fortune to go to a week-long grief retreat with my husband at the Onsite Foundation just outside of Tennessee, which for anybody who's lost a child, they provide you have to apply, but they have this beautiful program where they provide free services, a 6-day grief retreat for parents, specifically for parents who've lost children. And so we went to this, and there was this medicine wheel ceremony that was part of it in the beginning. And for people who don't know what a medicine wheel is, it's Native American tradition, and there's these rocks pointing, like roughly like a compass, northeast, south, and west. And you're simply instructed to go out and pick the rock that most speaks to you. And as soon as we got there, I knew which rock right away was I was attracted to. It was this big rock in the back, and it kind of looked like a mountain to me, and it just spoke to me. So I went to that rock, and I thought for sure others would join me because I'm like, this is a really cool rock, and nobody did, and there were 52 people there. And lots of people were doubling up on like these much smaller little rocks. And I thought, oh, okay, this is interesting. So I sort of settled in. And then our guide came around and whispered to us what the totem animal was that was associated with each of the rocks. And I was like, could kind of feel my heart starting to like beat a little faster. And I also heard my son, Patrick, who could also be very playful. I mean, he was an amazing kid. He was very wondrous, sort of had a sense of wonder about him. Very empathic, and I could hear him giggling, like, just wait, mom, until you hear what you get. And so he comes and he whispers, grizzly bear. And I sort of like startled, grizzly bear, and I have all these images of like this fierce, grizzly that's like attacking people, and people are afraid of it. And we got a chance at the end to ask questions about it, and I was very much like conflicted. Like, on the one hand, it kind of had landed in me with like this knowing of like, yeah, okay, that fits, like the strong one. But then I was like, oh, people are afraid of them, which I will say I think is this duality that I kind of had experienced throughout my life of being like a strong woman and not always knowing. And this could be for anybody who's sort of been forced or sees themselves as overly one way, a strong man, a strong woman, whatever, where it is really hard to be vulnerable or to have your needs met. But what ended up happening that night is we had a discussion about it, and he asked me what I knew about grizzly bears, and I kind of had this negative connotation, and he said, well, no, they're actually, whenever I see a lone woman on that rock, I know that like she is a great protector. And
Mm.
that was very bitter and very sweet because I had seen myself as a protector. It's why I went into the role that I did as a public interest lawyer. I protected the environment from polluters. And it's also why, having lost my youngest son, just 3 days after graduating from high school, that identity of who am I now that I don't have that, that my youngest cub anymore to protect. and where does that love go, because grief is really love with nowhere to go. And that, all of that, it was like this full circle moment where I understood at a very profound level and was able to access compassion for myself about why I had been so lost and so unable to, you know, just feel any forward movement in my life. I just felt like I kept circling and circling, which then of course can lead to depression and, numbness and all of that. And it was a remembering of who I was, because yes, I did possess that strength, and that strength had served me well before. Um, and it was still there. And I just needed to learn to access it in a different way. And so, I write on Substack Lost and Found because we have these moments, it's not just this linear thing, but we have these moments. And for me, that was a profound moment of remembering who I really was. And then when we go through life and we have, these, curveballs, to say the least, thrown at us, it's very easy to forget who we are. And I have done that shedding of identity over the last 20 years. And over the last 10 years since I left the law, it's been this, like, my, career has often felt very confusing. And then losing my son has just became the thing that sort of, I will say, kind of cracked me open to reclaiming all those lost parts of myself, because I think that's also a phenomenon we all know when we go through profound loss in our life, is we start to, over time, if we can get to the place of acceptance, to remember and to rejoin these pieces of ourselves maybe that have become fragmented or lost.
I think that's really beautiful what you said there because I've told people grief can feel like you're driving in your car at 100 miles an hour down the freeway and you just hit something head on full force. And it's such a jarring, shocking experience that it literally knocks you off your foundation. And at that point, that's why, as you said, we forget these parts of ourselves. I love that you talked about being drawn to this mountain-shaped rock and the grizzly bear. I love that because that was a very steadfast reminder of who you actually are. But when you go through those throes of grief that everybody experiences, we forget those parts of ourselves because we got really bumped into the experience of what was going on. And when we get shaken out of ourselves that harshly, we forget who we are. And so it does take a lot of work and it takes a lot of strength, by the way, to crawl back to that place to say, who am I? Where are my strengths? And do I remember this part about myself? And that's part of the healing journey that I think is very beautiful when people do rediscover, reconnect with those facets of who they are. It oftentimes, by the way, comes back stronger than it was before you went through the grief. You get very clear about who you are, and it's not even a question anymore. You might have before grief said, well, I kind of think I'm strong. I kind of think I'm this. After grief, it becomes, I am strong. I am
Mhm.
confident in who I am. I know who I'm supposed to be. It comes from a deeper rooted place of conviction, and it's because of that grief experience we had that solidifies and permanent puts that in place for us to really understand just who we are and how strong we can be.
Yes, 100%, Chris, to all of that. And, it's also occurring to me as I think about the name of your podcast. I was drawn to the name because empowerment, I've called myself an empowerment coach. I feel like that's what I did as a lawyer and everything. But what I've come to realize, I mean, grief is, I think you just said it, but it's very humbling. And to get to that place of acceptance is humbling. And so it's a little bit paradoxical, because I don't actually always see that, um, we grief isn't choosing to grieve isn't always an empowered choice. It's often a surrender, is what I've experienced. And so that
Mm.
was really on the other side of that conversation about the grizzly bear. The postscript to that was that later that night, when I went back to my room and my husband was asleep, I'm not a big crier, but I was on the floor doing some stretches, and I just let out this just huge sort of guttural wail. I'm surprised my husband didn't wake up, but he didn't. And I think that to me was sort of like a moment of just surrendering, of realizing that I needed to let go of this sort of false image of who I thought I had to be, and that had truly kept me separate for a lot of my, grief journey, that I was still very much operating from that. And I didn't even consciously know it, as much as I thought, I have a lot of internal awareness about my feelings, but then putting them out, like, there into the public. For instance, there's a difference between grieving, which we do in private, and mourning, which we do in public. The mourning aspect of grief, I was not at all comfortable with because there was that need to be vulnerable. And what I learned during that grief retreat, and it had been coming in waves, was just like, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot remain separate, and so I would touch in and touch out of that,
Mm.
the last probably the year leading up to that grief retreat. I had been sort of experimenting, and that was just the culmination of realizing that, like, yes, I'm strong, but yes, I also need to allow myself to break down, to be messy, because that is actually only once we sort of break down and really let go can, and surrender, um, can we really sort of then begin to, rebuild, reconstruct, and maybe start to kind of find our way forward.
I Laurel, that was really powerful what you just said, by the way. And I want to touch on this for listeners to this podcast. What Laurel just said, by the way, about breaking down and feeling those emotions and crying, that is not weakness. That is vulnerability and that is strength. That is what that
Mhm.
is. Coming back to Mama Bear with the mountain rock really quickly, that is strength. And that's something that I'm trying to connect with men in the grief world in that aspect because men know anger and we know silence, but in between this giant chasm of things is emotion. And men are taught that's weakness. And it's actually that polar opposite of that. What Laurel just said today, guys, on the podcast about being able to break down, letting out a gutting wail. When we walk around with grief, by the way, and most people do this, there's a big mask on top of ourselves. We don't want to show people that we're suffering. We don't want to show people because it's considered weak for some weird reason that I don't understand. But when we actually get real with ourselves for that moment, and I loved how you said more eloquently too, like touch that grief for a minute, just put our hands on it to see what it feels like, sounds like, looks like. When we allow ourselves to do that, it's a little uncomfortable because we're conditioned not to. But when you allow yourself to do that, you get real with yourself. And that's the vulnerability, by the way. And the thing I just want to build on, and I'll wrap up with this, is nobody's judging you about this, by the way. Nobody is. This is your journey. And who not better to give yourself permission to explore what Laurel just described, by the way, than yourself?
And if I could just add one thing, we recently had a walk to commemorate my what would have been my son's 21st birthday, and I came across this beautiful quote from the writer Ram Dass, and he said, "We're all just here to walk each other home." And it really made me think about grief because grief, as I said, is communal and it needs to be witnessed. And so I think we're afraid to feel our grief because we're going to be overwhelmed. But to me, what I remember is that home is where love is, and when I'm grieving, I'm loving. And so that just makes me feel like I'm coming home when I'm grieving, and because that's where the love is. And so we can't be grieving 100% of the time because we would be overwhelmed. But to everybody listening, because I've been one of those people, you'll be okay and you'll be the stronger and the better for it if you allow yourself to touch into the grief and adapt to it.
I love that you said that because that's what I had to learn after losing my son. And I was one of those people, listeners, I'm being very open with you guys right now. I was one of those very type of men, like, okay, I was taught not to feel, I was taught not to open up about these things or be emotional about it. When I lost my child, that all ended because I died that day. And I'm being open to share what Laurel's describing, by the way. I allowed myself to feel it. I said, I'm hurt. I am very sad. I'm very angry. I'm very frustrated. I allowed myself to go there. And when that mask comes off, by the way, like Laurel's showing you guys today on the podcast, when you get rid of that mask and just say, this is who I am, this is how I feel, this is my grief journey, nobody else gets to tell me how to do it, you will be surprised how much more calm you'll be in that moment and how much more raw and real you'll get with yourself. And when you give yourself permission just to feel, just to be you, it's like a big weight that comes off your shoulders. And that's when you can really feel the love and the empathy and the compassion and the kindness and the awareness, by the way. And when we talk about acceptance, those are all the steps to get to acceptance, is exactly what we've just been talking about.
Absolutely.
Laurel, I was going to ask you, it sounds like there's been a pattern of threes in your life. And I wanted to ask you, since you're into the spiritual realm of things like I am, has that represented anything to you as you've walked along your healing journey?
Well, in the three that you're referring to is, my father, Patrick's father, and then Patrick leaving. And the three is the Holy Trinity as well, right? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So I do think that there is something profoundly spiritual about that. What I will say, what that means to me is that grief is cyclical. And we could have a whole nother conversation, but I now know from having done a lot of deep dive into my own grief is often inherited, and we're often repeating generational patterns of grief that most of us aren't even aware of. And one of my intentions and goals is to try to make this world a more grief friendly place for the younger people, because I feel we've done a huge disservice to them, and continue to, by not being able to talk more openly about all of the wounds that we carry, that our grandparents carried, that our parents carry. I certainly know that I, was raised by parents who carried a lot of wounds and a lot of grief, and that there's a whole pattern of grieving. And I know that to be true on my children's father's side as well, that he was carrying a lot of grief. And Patrick was born to a grieving mother, and so he came into the world, and we know that there's epigenetics. We know that kids, that we pass this on, from the moment a child is conceived, that they're inheriting all the emotions and the trauma that whatever that the mother may be going through, and the father, for that matter. So that's a really big answer to your question, but yes, I do think that there is something significant to the three. I think about, I like to think about things at the root cause at a very deep level, because that's how, that's where the healing can really occur.
Have you, I wanted to ask you too, because I had my first experience with a medium last Saturday, and I went into it very open-minded because again, I'm one of these people that everybody's got lots of opinions on that, and I respect everybody for their beliefs, whatever way it goes. I wanted to ask you, is that something you've ever considered after losing Patrick, or maybe that you did?
Oh, yeah, I could tell you a few stories. I did consider it, but I didn't even actually, well, so yes, when 3 months after Patrick was gone, his brother, I took my oldest son, his brother, to Ireland where he was going to college, and I went and spent a month by myself over in the far western course, because that was my MO, to withdraw, to be alone. And I didn't want to be around when all the kids were leaving for college, because that was going to remind me that that's where Patrick would have been going. And so I sought out somebody. I was looking for a medium while I was there, and I didn't actually find one. But what did end up happening is Patrick found me, which sounds crazy, but he did. And I came home, and my sister-in-law came over and said, "I have a story to tell you." And she handed me a planter of flowers and said, "This is from Patrick." And I just looked at her, because my sister-in-law is not at all somebody who's, deep into the spiritual world or anything like that. And she had been at a party while I was in Ireland, and there was somebody had hired sort of a fortune teller, psychic person there, and that woman had been looking all night for somebody who knew somebody named Patrick, and my sister-in-law was the last one in the room, and she proceeded to share all of these things. She said, I see he's a bright light and a bright orb behind you. And she said, oftentimes when people, she said, do you know somebody who, took their life? And then proceeded to say all these things that Patrick wanted to deliver messages to. And it was very, very profound. And when I heard the things, I mean, he knew specifics that I had done with some of his possessions and who I had given them to, and he really liked that. But most importantly, he just wanted me and his brother to know that he was really sorry, and that he loved us deeply, and that he knew he had a really good life. And on top of the very specific things, it was just like you couldn't make it up. And so yes, I absolutely believe that our loved ones live here amongst us, and some of us are gifted to be able to connect with them. I will say that I do talk to Patrick. Do I have those level of specific conversations? No, but it's an energetic frequency. So I guess I believe in mediums. I sought one out once on my own, but aside from that story that I just shared, there were at least two or three other instances of either people that I met who I didn't know had this capability, who then said, by the way, can I share something with you from your son? Or people that I maybe had gone to for something to do with like coaching in the career realm, who also have, because a lot of people have this talent. And because his presence would be so powerful, and because he was wanting to connect with me so clearly and let me know that he was okay and that he loved me, he came through multiple times. And I have to say, that was profoundly affirming for me in that first year. And I actually think it made a huge difference in my ability to keep moving, because that kid found ways to, and he was a really smart kid, and he found really clever ways. So I didn't get always signals or things like that, but he found people to deliver messages to me.
How did that, it sounds like that provided a lot of comfort to you in your healing
Uh,
journey.
It 100% did, to the point where I realized that some time had passed. Those kept coming to me probably the first, 16 to 18 months. Um, and then it had been like a year and I hadn't, and I gotten any, and I thought, do I need to seek that out? And what I realized was like, I was feeling his presence with me all the time. And so that need that had initially been there wasn't as strong. Um, so I think about it occasionally. I will say the one person that I had to get on a wait list, the one person that I sought out as a medium wasn't that great. Like I didn't really feel like she had that strong of a connection. So I think that I think a lot of it's like chemistry, it's like dating, right? I think it just depends on whether that person can access your loved one in the moment.
I found it very powerful, and like I said, I would encourage people to find a medium you resonate with, by the way, but to go with an open mind of things. Don't go into it with preconceived notions of things. Because my experience I have is very similar to yours. Um, I was very shocked because my grandfather came through very loud, and the medium. And I'll preface for people listening. I did not tell this medium anything about my son. I didn't tell her about my grandfather. I didn't tell details about things at all. And the stuff that came through, I broke down crying and I was in shock because I was going, that's stuff only I know about my grandfather, and I've never shared it with people before. But I think it's a great way for people to connect with our loved ones. And I do think, and I agree with you, Laurel. We talked a lot in the pre-interview about spirituality as going through grief. And I'm a firm believer that I don't think this life that we live today, right here, right now, I don't think this is the end. I think it's the beginning to something. I think our life really does move on from here. And I think that um, on the research I've learned and grown from, I've learned that before we even come here, we sign soul contracts that basically say what we're going to experience in our life. We signed up for it. And um, that was a hard thing for me to learn in my grief process to say I signed up to lose a son. Ouch, that
Yeah,
hurts.
yeah.
Like,
No,
um,
I will say that I did talk to some people, and I had the same thing, very, very deep levels of a couple different mediums, mystics told me that, he and I made this agreement before we came here. And it was, I will say to you, I had a similar thought of like, well, that really hurts. But at the same time, it also landed sort of with like this deep knowing, because I always knew that I've said this about both my kids that our children are our teachers, 100%. I think parents, we think the world thinks we're the teachers. It's the other way around. And so it resonated with me on that level. But yeah, it is a very hard thing. And, you know, but as you know, I also am an intuitive astrologer, and so I very much believe that we are souls that come back, in different lifetimes, for different purposes, and sometimes we have to learn really hard lessons, and I don't want to say lessons. That sounds punitive, but just have to evolve in ways that are really painful, and
I,
that's the human journey.
I think that's fair what you said, by the way, because that's something that I teach people through grief coaching a lot. And I only share this, by the way, when people are open to it and it's the right time. But even in the darkest moments of our grief, the darkest moments of our loss, there's always gifts and lessons and blessings for us to take from those moments. And I always preface this to say that does not take away your emotions, your experience you're having with that. It does not take away from that. But it is something, by the way, that when you do find those, and they'll find you on your own time, by the way. It's why I can't say that it's going to happen to you in a month or a year. I can't say that, but I'll say when they do find you, that chapter of life you went through with grief will have so much deep meaning and purpose for who you're becoming. And when you're able to go out into the world with that gift that you found, that blessing that you found out of those moments of life, I can tell you right now, your contribution to the world will be bigger than you even know about. And that's really, really the purpose of life. I've had this awakening myself, and I'd love to get your take on this, by the way, but our society is so driven by status and money and how big our houses
Um,
are and our jobs and our titles of things. And
mhm.
and when you go through a big thing of grief, like you and I have done, especially losing a child, like you and I have had, our whole world shifts perspective in that avenue, and we come to this place of saying, what we do every day. I'm an acceptance coach, where you're at right now with what you do in your journey. We're contributing to the world bigger than ourselves because of that circumstance that happened to us. I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So grief is an opportunity, I believe, to live a more sacred life. And when we live a more sacred life, we're open. We're open to all the things that we've just talked about, to seeing life beyond the 3D material world, but to seeing it in a 5D and multidimensional way. And yes, our society is caught up in the materialism of life. And by that, I don't even mean wealth. I just mean the status and the roles and the titles and the responsibilities. And that's how I definitely spent the first 40 plus years of my life, is being really caught up in that striving, improving. And grief, if we allow it, gives us the opportunity to understand that we are really only ever here to belong to ourselves. And that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But what I mean by that is that I was somebody who very much chased belonging in the external world, that I chased it through, my academic achievements, through my jobs, through the titles, even through being a mother, I mean, that very much defined who I was. And these are all things that we're told are good, and they are, and they're lovely, but they can never replace our deep sense of self acceptance and belonging within ourselves, because truly, that I believe is what we are all here to learn about. And I think for me, that's been the biggest thing that grief has been here to teach me, is in a really profound and difficult way, but by having people and things removed from my life, beyond my control, to really get me to understand that at a deep, deep level, who I am is, uh, an entirely loving, wonderful person capable of enormous strength, but that needs to come from really having the sense of kind of coming home to yourselves, if you will.
Well, Laurel, that was beautifully said. And I think that's the ultimate journey of grief, is to become that person in our life where what we value and what we seek all comes from within. We don't have to seek it externally in the world. And when we find it here, it's
Yeah.
ultimate peace, it's ultimate love, it's ultimate gratitude, it's ultimate achievement is to find everything within and not
It's
have to be
liberation as
filtered.
well. It's
That's
ultimate
the word I was looking
liberation.
for.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, I just want to say this has been a very, very powerful episode on the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I just want to say a big, big thank you to you through coming on today and sharing your grief journey and sharing your story about everything that Patrick taught you on this grief journey. I think he gave
Mhm.
you an enormous gift, an enormous blessing in your life, bigger than I'm sure you see right now,
Mm.
because you're doing wonderful work in the space that you're in. Um, I wanted to ask you as we wrap up the show, I always ask my guests a couple questions. If you were to run into somebody who's going through grief or maybe feels stuck in grief, what's one thing that you would share with them to help them navigate that journey just a little bit easier?
Mm. Oh my gosh. I think it would be two things that I've touched on. One is to not be afraid to feel the feelings because grief underneath grief is love. And so that's how we, remember and honor the person. And also, I would say that don't go it alone. That you need that grief in order to heal. Grief needs to be witnessed, and so even if that's one other person, don't be afraid to share your feelings or go to a grief support group. I mean, they do exist and they are out there. Or find some way to honor your loved one in a way that is visible or communicates what that person meant to you. There are different ways that we can share our grief that outside of maybe a one-on-one conversation, but I think it's really imperative to not repress it and not have it stay stuck inside, because then that's when a numbness can set in, or when we can feel disoriented and dislocated from life, and when life can really just become overwhelming, and that's not what our loved ones would want for us.
That's beautifully said, Laurel. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And for listeners today that are listening to this episode, if they want to connect with you after listening, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can go to my website, laurelosullivan.com. They can email me, laurel@laurelosullivan.com, and they can find me on Substack under Laurel O'Sullivan, Lost and Found.
Well, I want to thank you again for being on the podcast today. For listeners, I will have Laurel's contact information in the show notes here on Apple and Spotify and Podbean. I also, if you guys are following me on Facebook, I'll have it there too when the episode comes out. I do want to recommend to you guys to reach out to her. She's a very beautiful person, and as you guys heard today, she's got a powerful story and a unique ability to help other people go through grief. So, Laurel, I just want to say thank you so much for being a wonderful guest on today's show.
Mm. Thank you, Chris. It's been a real pleasure to be here.
And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining Laurel and I today on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Laurel's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can also find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. You guys are never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.